welcome to all of you who are present here with us tonight. And welcome to all of you who join us online anywhere in the world you may be. Welcome to Vancouver, this beautiful land that we have the blessing to call home, where we live, work, study, and worship on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coast, and Salish peoples. Such a blessing to be able to call this land home. Tonight we have a great lecture, but if for any reason you need to leave these facilities this week, we would like to ask you to be mindful of the sliding door opening and closing in order to prevent any disruption from the outside. In the same way, if you have any electronic device that produces any sound, we would like to ask you to put it in silent. Anything that buzzes, dings, or rings, please put it in silent. We want to prevent any disruption to our lecture tonight. Lastly, I would like to read a legal disclaimer related to this evening lecture. Regent College hereby announces that tonight's evening public lecture is being filmed, photographed, and live streamed. By entering this location, you agree that Regent College has the right to use your likeness, image, voice, etc. in any marketing, advertising, and related endeavors. You also understand that you will not be compensated in any way for the use of your likeness, image, voice, etc. Being in this location means that you release and hold Regent College harmless from any claims or actions that arise as a result of this production. Thank you. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Jeff Greenman. He is a president here at Regent and also a professor of theology and ethics. Professor Greenman.
Well, thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you all of you for being here, and my own greetings to you and to those of you who are with us in the live stream as well. So I'm Jeff Greenman. I'll be your host for tonight and MC, and most of you have been at evening public lectures before, probably, and you know how we do these things. But first of all, let me tell you how we're going to do that, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So our speaker will come in just a few minutes here to address us for around 50 or so minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for our discussion back and forth. And in order to do that, if you have a question to make, then go to the top of the stairs on either side and use the mic so all of us can hear what you're saying and those on live stream can follow along as well. And we'll have a chance for some discussion back and forth. So we'll finish by 9 o'clock for sure. And then afterwards, Dr. Noll will be at the bookstore for a book signing where there's a table with many of his many books. So every author loves to sign books. That's a hint. So there's plenty of opportunity with a prolific author like our speaker tonight. So that's how we'll operate tonight. And let me now introduce Mark Noll, who is a person around Regent that virtually needs no introduction at all. He's been a visitor on summer school for, I don't know, over a dozen times, I'm thinking, something like that. And it's always been a delight to have him come and teach with us and share these evening public lectures. So Dr. Mark Noll needs almost no introduction. He's an eminent historian of Christianity, particularly North American Christianity, and even Canadian Christianity that we'll hear about tonight. He's the author of many, many books. The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind would be familiar to many of you. The offspring of that book and subsequent book, Jesus Christ and the Life of the Mind, I would commend to you. And there's so many books out there, but one of the more recent ones I wanted to mention that's out on the book table that might catch your interest. Let me get the title just right here. America's Book, The Rise and Decline of a Bible Civilization, 1794 to 1911. So it has been a joy to have Mark with us. He's teaching right now a course in summer school. Are any of you students in the class right now? A few of you are students right now, coming back for more with Mark. It is a delight to be able to have this evening with him, where he'll tell you a little bit more about the background behind the title. But let me at least give you the title: Remembering George Rawlyk: Lessons from Canada's Christian Past for Canada's Christian Future. So let's welcome Dr. Mark Noll.
Introduction. got a picture of George Rawlyk coming, and there it is. Okay. It's been a great privilege to serve as an instructor over the years in Regent, spring, and summer schools. If my personal record keeping is correct, that privilege has included the opportunity to offer 18 different courses over the last 35 years. In speaking to others about my experience here, I've often said that while no institution is perfect, or without the need to do better what it's trying to do, Regent has seemed to me to be exemplary, because its engaged students have so often and so graciously taught me as much as I was trying to teach them, because Regent's administration and the teaching assistants I've been assigned have made visits as pain-free as possible. I should add also the tech people. Because the college has a great bookstore, because Regent is a model for international and multicultural Christian education, because it promotes the right kind of ironic evangelicalism, and because at Regent I have been blessed with treasured friends, some whose invaluable work goes on, and others like Ian Rennie and Don Lewis, whose rest is won. But there's another reason why I have found teaching at Regent so rewarding. For a long time, I've been convinced that if, as an American historian studying mostly American subjects, I had a clearer grasp of Canadian history, with so many things similar and yet some significantly different, I would have a richer understanding of historical developments on both sides of the 49th parallel. As a historian who's also a believer, I'm also keen to discover how the richer understanding might offer clues for using knowledge about the past to aid Christian life in the present. And so the chance to come to Regent and learn the personal stories of Canadians, to hear from American expats on why they came to Canada, and to see a little bit of Vancouver and British Columbia history up close, all have usefully supplemented what I could find out about Canada's past from books and other written sources. But most important for me in trying to understand Canadian history have been personal connections. And in my case, it was friendship with George Alexander Rawlyk that opened the door wide, not only to general Canadian history, but particularly to the history of Christianity in Canada. My plan this evening is to take most of our time sketching the contours of George's life and explaining why he was so significant for promoting the study of religion in Canada, and especially the study of Canadian evangelicals. But I hope also to take up the always tricky challenge of asking how insights from the past might offer guidance for the present. In this case, how George Rawlyk's contributions to Canadian history could help believers navigate in a contemporary world that in its religion now differs so dramatically from what religion was like in the historical periods that Rawlyk's work so insightfully illuminated. George Rawlyk, who grew up in Thorold, Ontario in the Niagara Peninsula, was born in May 1935. His parents were Ukrainian, father an immigrant and mother born in Canada. George's father, who worked in a paper mill that supplied newsprint to American publishers, bequeathed to his son a strong working class consciousness, as well as considerable suspicion of international corporate power. Rawlyk's primary early influence from outside the home, including his first steps in English, came through a mission conducted in his neighborhood by a single woman, Mary Renton, for the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec. Almost as early, he was welcomed into club activities organized for the youth of his community by the Canadian Communist Party. When he was in the 10th grade, he had what he later told his sisters was a spiritual experience at a weekend sponsored by the Interschool Christian Fellowship. Thereafter, he worked with Mary Renton in the mission and soon joined a Baptist church. During his undergraduate years at McMaster University, and despite a full academic and athletic schedule, he returned home on weekends to assist at Mary Renton's mission. In 1957, George received a bachelor's degree in history from McMaster. Because of his standout career as a center on the university's football team, he was drafted by the BC Lions of the Canadian Football League, the 4th overall draft pick of that year, but he chose instead to accept the fellowship he had won to study as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. After 2 years at Oxford, he returned to North America for graduate study in Canadian history at the University of Rochester. He then taught at Mount Allison and Dalhousie University in the Maritimes before moving in 1966 to Queen's University in Ontario. At Queen's, he later served as history department chair through tumultuous years marked by intense ideological conflict over the war in Vietnam and Canada's move to official multiculturalism. As he climbed the academic ladder, George remained an active member of local Baptist churches. He also frequently sponsored Christian student organizations, although he was once asked to step down as sponsor of the InterVarsity chapter at Mount Allison because of his involvement with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. As a lifelong democratic socialist, he was strongly committed to first the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and then its successor, the New Democratic Party, the NDP. My last personal conversation with George took place in May 1995, shortly after the NDP, under Premier Bob Rae, had been defeated in its effort to remain Ontario's governing party. George said that although the NDP had encountered difficulties in running Ontario, he would, as he put it, die happy, that the utter disaster so many pundits had foreseen if the NDP ever came to power had not remotely come to pass. As I listened to this political commentary, I was chuckling inwardly, since George made this pronouncement just after he had convened at Queen's the largest, most ambitious, and most informative conference ever held on the history of evangelical Protestants in Canada. I knew I had to be in Canada, since it was all but impossible in the US to hear the words socialist, Baptist, evangelical in the same sentence. Later in the fall of 1995, George was in an automobile accident as he drove from Ottawa to Kingston upon returning from a trip to England. On November 23, 1995, the US's Thanksgiving Day, he died from complications resulting from that accident. Rawlyk first made his mark as an academic by studying the 18th century history of the maritime provinces, particularly relations with Britain's colonies in New England. Much of that scholarship dealt with the meteoric career of Henry Allen and the social-political impact of that career. Allen was a passionate revivalist whose electric preaching promoted a new light stir with widespread effect in the region for several years before and after his early death in 1784. As someone who studied the place of religion in the American Revolution, I was intrigued to learn from George that Allen's powerful itinerant preaching helped keep Nova Scotians fixated on local concerns and their own religious lives, with the results that they proved unresponsive to invitations from New England to join the American Revolution. George's first major publications were intent on showing that the history of the Atlantic provinces in the 18th century and beyond was that this history was much more significant than professionals in the field acknowledged. And what we have on the screen here are the books that he prepared early in his career on these topics. The list includes 2 stories for children, which not too many historians try to write. They're actually quite well done. It was not, however, until he reached the midpoint of his career that George figured out a way to write about Allen and religion more generally in terms respecting both the kind of spiritual experience witnessed in the New Light Stir and the conventions of historical writing as those conventions had come to prevail in the modern academy. The elements that made Allen endlessly fascinating to Rawlyk were the revivalist populist style, his intense preoccupation with spiritual realities, and his ardent commitment to the lives of ordinary men and women joined together in deep congregational fellowship. But how could he write about such matters in an academic climate that paid scant attention to the inner meaning of religious faith, or that showed little interest in connections between religion on the one side and politics, society, economics, or culture on the other? Rawlyk took some guidance from the Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who had described the course of cultural hegemony. including hegemony over the practice of religion, as a process by which those who controlled economic life and the media shaped a whole society's perception of reality. This insight explained for George why the expansion of Canada's consumer society would come to undermine the piety he so admired in Allen and the Maritime Baptists, who were Allen's spiritual stepchildren. Help from another direction came from the insights of the cultural anthropologist Victor Turner. Turner had used the term liminality in his study of African traditional religion, and then as a general way of crediting the social reality and personal meaningfulness of transcendent religious experience. Applying Turner to Henry Allen gave George an academically credible way of treating religion as foundational instead of epiphenomenal. But the most important new influence came from the example of historians who are bringing out serious academic works on evangelical Christian groups in the United States. George Marsden's 1980 book, Fundamentalism in American Culture, exerted a particularly important influence. Rawlyk was intrigued that a reputable university press had published Marsden's well-received study with its deployment of standard, this-worldly historical explanations, but also while treating the beliefs and practices of American fundamentalists as essential first-order elements of their history. So it was that from the early 1980s, a number of vectors came together to propel Rawlyk's own work, and in so doing, helped reshape the understanding of religion in Canada. He may also be said, with only slight exaggeration, to invented or created the subfield of Canadian evangelical history. These vectors included theoretical insights and motivating examples from other scholars, his own long-standing research interest in Henry Allen and then other Christian movements, George's personal experience as an evangelical with his own memorable conversion experience, his strong convictions as a socialist about the dangers inherent whenever unchecked capitalism prevailed, his powerful presence as a lecturer and seminar director, his skill as an organizer of events and recruiter of collaborators, and not least, his savvy in securing funding from sources that had funds to distribute because of the kind of capitalist activity Rawlyk's socialist principles disparaged. During his tenure at Queen's, Rawlyk inspired fear but also reverence as a demanding teacher. 6 weeks before his death, he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Civil Law honoris causa from Acadia University in Nova Scotia. Part of the presentation for the degree was made by one of his former students, Professor Barry Moody, who spoke of that teaching. For more than 30 years, Rawlyk has stimulated, provoked, bullied, encouraged, terrified, and taught several generations of young historians. His seminars were the stuff of which legends are made, to which students frequently went in fear and trembling, but also in great anticipation. For this was a big man, both physically and intellectually. If one survived the first grueling months, one eventually discovered that beneath this gruff exterior was a compassionate, caring individual to whom his students meant a very great deal, whose careers he followed closely after they left his seminar nest, and for whom no effort or exertion was too great. As a research mentor at Queen's, George supervised more than 100 theses and dissertations on a wide range of Canadian topics, but with an increasing number focused on religion, and of those, a healthy portion devoted to evangelical subjects. George also worked tirelessly to see scholarship on evangelicals and more general religious topics get into print. In the late 1980s, he became the editor of an influential series in religious history from McGill Queen's University Press. Success in securing support from the Jackman Foundation, combined with shrewd recruiting of authors, led to the publication under his oversight of 26 books. They included a number of works by younger scholars, Phyllis Earhart, Robert Birkinshaw. The next slide will show some of these books, if I can get the slide to move. Maybe we'll get the slide to move. There we go. A number of younger scholars, Phyllis Earhart, Robert Birkinshaw, Nancy Christie, Brian Fraser, Michael Govro, Neil Semple, Marguerite Van Dee, William Westphal, who would become leaders in expanding and deepening understanding of Canada's Christian past. After Rawlyk's death, a second series of titles under the direction of Donald Harmon Akinson has now reached 100 volumes, about half devoted to a wide range of Canadian religious topics, again with many treating evangelicals, individuals, groups, or themes. In the first years of this second series, at least 7 or 8 of the books were authored by young scholars whom George had mentored. In an era of rapidly proliferating scholarship about all aspects of North American religion, and now with books on religious subjects coming from a host of first-rate publishers, the McGill-Queen series remains one of the 2 most extensive book series from a university press featuring North American religious history. Rawlyk's dedicated efforts on behalf of other scholars were matched by steady production of his own writing. From the early 1980s, these works offered fresh accounts of Henry Allen, other revivals of the Allen era, and more general works on Canadian revival traditions. In these works, some from McGill-Queen's University Press and others from religious publishers, George concentrated on the meaning of evangelical experience for those who participated in those events. He did treat social, political, and psychological ways of understanding the revivals, but insisted that these accounts supplement rather than replace what the participants described as their encounters with God. And these are the books that were produced treating those subjects. In a related sphere, Rawlyk assisted Gerald Zeman and other sponsors of the Baptist History in Atlantic Canada project in promoting a new depth of interpretation for the nation's Baptist history. In so doing, and with later efforts overseen by Gordon Heath and the Canadian Baptist Historical Society, George helped make study of Canadian Baptists one of the most flourishing enterprises for any Protestant denomination in North America. The results have by no means convinced the world at large that Canadian history hinges on the fate of the Baptists, but expert attention to a relatively small denomination and out-of-the-way corners of Canada has brought unprecedented clarity to the historical record and the ongoing significance of this one Canadian tradition. And these are some of the Baptist books that George helped to produce. Throughout his career, the public presence of the personal George Rawlyk was never far from the book-writing life of the historian George Rawlyk. In many acts of personal attention to students, colleagues, and friends, George lived out a faith that mirrored the religion of at least some of the historical figures he so much admired. Without retreating from his firm convictions, George could also bend when confronted with a good faith rejoinder. Brian Stiller, now a global ambassador for the Evangelical Alliance, but from 1983 to 1997, head of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, the EFC, has provided one example. Stiller recounts that he first met Rawlyk at a conference sponsored by Citizens for Public Justice, the advocacy group funded by Reform believers shaped by the worldview thinking of Abraham Kuyper. After speaking on a story from the Old Testament, Stiller opened the floor for Q&A. And as he recounts the exchange, Rawlyk, in his imposing self, stood and raked me over the coals for what he perceived was funding of the ESC from large donors who, by their conservative inclinations, were driving our agenda. Stiller continues, I remember waiting for him to finish. And it would sometimes take quite a while for George to finish. I remember waiting for him to finish. And I realized the only way to speak to George was by being as forthright as he was to me, and so I did, with Stiller imparting the information that the EFC had never received a large breakthrough gift of any kind from any source. The result was a lasting friendship, which included invitations from Stiller to Rawlyk to appear on Cross Currents, the panel show that Stiller hosted for the EFC on Vision television. In the last decade of his life, George's labors expanded to take in the full history of Canadian Protestantism, to explore evangelical connections throughout the English-speaking world, and to offer a sharper interpretation of evangelicalism throughout Canadian history. While never abandoning his fascination for the era of Henry Allen, he also added significant attention to the present, and these are the books that came in that last period. Attention to the present led to the cooperation with the public opinion researcher Angus Reid in an effort to assess the general state of religion in Canada. For that purpose, and again with support from a major foundation, George helped Angus Reid and his associates craft a survey that included questions geared to the 4 characteristics David Bebbington had identified as basic to evangelicalism: the experience of conversion, trust in the Bible, emphasis on the cross of Christ, and evangelistic or other activity in response to the gospel. Results of the survey, which reached 4,000 Canadians and an equal number in the US, then informed George's 3 last books, 2 of them published posthumously. They constituted a summative resume that linked the historian looking back to the past with the participant looking around at his own generation. We got socialist softball in here too soon. Sorry. Well, there's the book. His book from 1994, The Canada Fire, reprised earlier assessments of Henry Allen in late 18th century Nova Scotia, but now expanded to other Protestants in New Brunswick and Upper Canada who promoted what George called radical evangelicalism. They included Methodist itinerants, sectarian Presbyterians from Scotland, liberated slaves fleeing from the new United States, and maritime Baptist groups he described as strongly influenced by the Allenite spirit. Common to all was, in his words, the experiential language of the new birth, emphasizing a personal relationship with a convert with Almighty God through Jesus Christ, along with patterns of evangelical worship in daily life shaped by the new birth experience. The book contended that this kind of evangelicalism dominated Canadian Protestantism for more than a generation. It was, in George's rendering, more radical, more anarchistic, more democratic, and more populist than its American counterpart, freed from the baggage of American civic humanism, republicanism, and the covenant ideal and possessive individualism. The conference I mentioned earlier from May 1995, which drew interested participants from Ireland, Italy, Scotland, England, and Australia, as well as the United States and throughout Canada, led to the publication of a landmark book the next year, Aspects of the Canadian Protestant Experience. With his characteristic energy, George had secured revisions for the 34 papers going into that volume, and had also drafted the book's introduction before his untimely death late in 1995. This book's contributions range very widely in examining evangelical currents among Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, United Church people, Baptists, Lutherans, Mennonites, fundamentalists, holiness bodies, and Pentecostals. There were treatments of leaders, missionaries, networks, events, and constituency, and it included perspectives from Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In introducing the book, George sketched his own understanding of the subject. Canadian evangelicalism began with the radicalism of the Allen era. Then after the War of 1812, it became more formal as Protestant leaders constructed a faith to serve social and political needs. This type of evangelicalism was sustained deep into the 20th century, but then at least some of the earlier characteristics returned after World War II. The arguments sketched in the introduction to the Aspects volume received full-scale treatment in George's last monograph, which is going to appear on the screen as soon as we move to the next slide. There it is. Is Jesus Your Personal Savior? In Search of Canadian Evangelicalism in the 1990s. His evidence included the rise of Pentecostalism, but also the resistance in some evangelical circles to American influences and the replacement of liberal Protestant hegemony in theological education by bodies with evangelical convictions. And at that point in the book, Regent gained a mention with its emphasis on evangelical theological education. Though his coverage of that subject, in his coverage, George characteristically dwelt mostly on recent history of Acadia. He also expressed surprise at how many evangelicals, at least identified by the Bebbington characteristics, could be identified. More than 15% of the Canadian population. Of those, about 1/3 came from self-identified evangelical denominations, another third were Roman Catholics, and about 1/5 came from mainline churches. George stated his conclusions forthrightly. He wrote, "I continue to see a real connection between the Canadian evangelicalism of the 1775 to 1815 period and the evangelicalism I am dealing with in the 1990s. There has always been a powerful, populist, spiritual, irenic quality to Canadian evangelicalism. This accommodating quality has muted sectarian tensions far more significantly than evangelicalism in the United States." I first met George in the summer of 1984 at a time when his efforts on behalf of a fuller account of Canada's religious history was gathering steam, and as his difficult years as chair of the Queen's History Department were coming to an end. The occasion was a conference organized by Joel Carpenter, himself a notable historian of American fundamentalism, who was at the time director of Wheaton College's Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, the ISAE. George had secured grant money to convene a short summer colloquium in Massachusetts and Cape Cod for planning projects and sharing work in progress. He knew that Rawlyk had been reading books by George Marsden, Nathan Hatch, Harry Stout, and a few others in the loose ISAE network. For his part, Rawlyk was intrigued about the possibility of becoming personally acquainted with Marsden and these other Yankees. Yet as a Canadian nationalist, a democratic socialist, a critic of American involvement in the Vietnam War, and someone very suspicious of capitalist big business, including the foundations that funded the ISAE, he was wary. He knew that one of his Queen's history undergraduates, John Stackhouse, had gone to study for a master's degree at Wheaton, but he had wondered if Wheaton would simply be indoctrinating John with the platitudes of fundamentalism instead of training him to be a genuine scholar. Joel Carpenter reports that when he and his wife Janice picked up George for the conference at the Boston airport, this very large Canadian sat huddled in the corner of the back seat, nervously assessing his fellow passengers and wondering if he was being spirited away into the clutches of a right-wing conspiracy. Very soon, however, the ice thawed, or in more appropriate metaphor, the ice firmed up, and George was skating along merrily with the Americans. Shared historical interest helped, but even more was the awareness that these Americans were engaging evangelical history critically as well as with empathy. Of central importance in establishing a good relationship was the rapport George created with the spouses and children of the historians. It had been possible for the grants to reimburse expenses for families to attend these summer meetings. Their attendance had always served to moderate at least some of the blinkered academic fixations of the historians. With George's presence, this element immediately became more important. He loved kids, kids loved him, and he warmed to the challenge of including wives and an occasional husband, since most of the historians are men, in the circle of fellowship. Over the years, George's role in pointing this group of historians toward human and not simply academic interest grew steadily. His organization of softball games at this and later summer meetings illustrated the effect of his presence. And I'm going to quote Joel Carpenter here now on what we came to call socialist softball. We'll see if we can find the slide that shows not a very good picture, but at least you'll get the idea. With George as arbiter, every kid got a hit. Junior professors who were too aggressive on the base paths were called out, and every game ended in a tie. Whenever the score became close in the late innings, George would look up at the sky and say, "I see rain coming," or "It's getting dark." Then he would roar, "Game is called. It ends in a tie." Nothing worked better to nurture the communal spirit of the ISAE than this annual ritual. Through an association lasting only slightly more than a decade, George helped edit 2 books from ISE projects, contributed essays to 4 others, and became an indispensable mainstay as advisor and friend to many historians in the broader ISAE network that extended beyond North America to take in the United Kingdom and Australia as well. Of particular significance for me and 1 or 2 others, George was our first personal link to the wider worlds of Canadian history. George Marsden's comment after the funeral, which he, Nathan Hatch, and I attended with our wives on a sleety Ontario day in late November 1995, spoke for what we had experienced. Nathan and our American George were spontaneously struck by the same biblical image for what our friend had meant to us as Americans. Against the drift of over 200 years of the U.S.'s own hegemonic history, he had pulled us at least partly into a Canadian orbit. And this is what George wrote. Nat then said exactly what I was thinking of saying. That was that George seemed a sort of Melchizedek to us. In terms of our American and Reformed categories, he seemed to walk into our lives from outside of our own worlds. He also appeared, especially in retrospect, as a sort of Christ-like figure, showing us what it ought to mean for academics to follow Jesus. We just did not expect Jesus to be quite so large. Of course, George realized, like the rest of us, that he was flawed, and his minister said at the funeral, only a sinner saved by God's grace. This is reassuring, too, for those of us who aren't very good at imitating either the type or the antitype. George's death, just as he was publishing his most comprehensive interpretation of Canadian evangelicalism, meant that memorials and reminiscences crowded out the critical attention his interpretations deserved. In subsequent years, others, including myself, have offered alternative, supplementary, or even contradicting accounts of how he had construed that history. Nonetheless, while debates concerning the subjects that drew Rawlyk's attention have gone in different directions, no one should deny the significance of what he accomplished. He led in stimulating interest in the general history of Canadian religion. He assisted the deepening of Baptist Canadian history. He challenged others to recognize the impact of radical evangelicalism. And he differentiated the history and character of evangelicals in Canada from their counterparts in the United States. But now, however, a considerable irony should have become obvious as I have been describing George Rawlyk's career and the extent of his influence. The irony is this: George played his part, a large part, in inspiring first-rate scholarship on religion in Canada, and especially on Protestant evangelicals, in the very years of precipitate decline of Christian faith in Canadian public life. How could his interpretation of Canadian Christianity, when it was central to Canadian life, possibly be helpful for those who live in a post-Christendom Canada? The answer may lie in the risky effort to let the shape of one historian's life and insights inform the present realities experienced by everyone, which is what I'll now try to do. If we can get the old screen working here. First, for Canadian believers in all tradition, it is worth remembering the question of the prophet. Who can despise the day of small things? Or the words of the apostle, God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human might boast in the power of God. In his citation for George Rawlyk's honorary degree in October 1995, Professor Barry Moody noted that when George began as a historian, leaders in the field had made central Canada and political developments of the 19th and 20th centuries a center of Canadian history. Rawlyk, in the face of such academic pressure, did what he would do throughout his career. He took dead aim at the margins. As Moody phrased it, turning his back on the collective wisdom of the day, Rawlyk chose to explore the history of a largely ignored region, the Maritime Provinces, and much neglected areas of study, the 18th century, and later the influence of religion in our past. The positive result that came from this one historian's obdurate peripheralism underscores the realization that faith arising from the margins can be just as significant as, or even more so, than faith enjoying authority at the center. In turn, that realization could counteract despair at the triumphs of secularization, while also letting believers of all sorts find help from what had long been considered the things that are not. In other words, as the credibility of historically powerful forms of Christianity declines, believers may take heart from communities that historically had no power. As one example that could not be more pertinent, Terry LeBlanc of the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies has explained how First Nation Christians have been extracting themselves, in his words, from the confines of Western church traditions and structures, including modes of government and worship. In his account, these efforts are expressing a particularly native Christianity that is not beholden to earlier assumptions about civilization and Christianity. Instead, they embrace the triple restorative mandate of right relationship with God and other spiritual powers, right relation with one another in the human community, and right relationship with and relatedness to the rest of creation, of which humanity is but a part. Without pretending to understand the inner working of George Rawlyk's psyche, it is noteworthy that this offspring of immigrants keyed his scholarship to groups with as little standing in their historical era as the first-generation Canadians of his era enjoyed. This positive result for historical study may suggest something about the future of Canadian Christianity. That future may lie not in simply adding to what had once existed, but with creativity, leadership, and gospel integrity coming not only from communities of Indigenous believers, but from Chinese Canadian Christians, Indian Canadian Christians, Nigerian Canadian believers, and the like. The result would be, as in this one historian's case, rejuvenation from the margins. For Canadian Protestants, second, Rawlyk's career prompts the thought that accepting, even embracing the end of Christendom need not entail a total rejection of everything Christendom once offered. To say the least, Rawlyk did not possess the pedigree of those who had long organized, dominated, and patrolled the borders of the nation's Protestant establishments. Working class instead of professional, a Ukrainian by heritage instead of English or Scottish, a Baptist rather than United Anglican or Presbyterian, a socialist instead of mainstream in his politics. Yet by playing by the rules of the game as he found them and taking advantage of openings that existed even for outsiders, he was able to make a difference. It may be a stretch, but if Canadian public life continues its deconstruction of what had once been Christendom, believers would seem to have three options. First, retreat into wistful nostalgia. Second, take the populist route to become culture warriors. Or third, accept the rules of the game as they now exist, but take advantage of the openings that remain for those who value Christianity itself more than Christendom. From my perspective, always a little foggy from south of the border, from my perspective, it looks like a number of Protestant organizations are already committed to the third option of simply getting on with what they can still do without worrying about what they cannot do. I'm thinking of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, Cardis, the Center for Public Justice, many self-described evangelical denominations, and Regent College, along with other institutions of Christian higher education. If George Rawlyk's career can be any guide, their savvy in using the remnants of Christendom is a path with promise. Third, for Canadian evangelicals, George Rawlyk's stance to the United States could be a useful guide for avoiding the weaknesses of American evangelicals, yet while continuing to benefit selectively from American resources. As in much of his historical work, Rawlyk's assessment of contemporary Canadian religion featured a strong sense of distance from the United States. In fact, anti-American would not be too strong to describe the preface he penned for his last book, Is Jesus Your Personal Savior?, which was written while Rawlyk was on leave in the American South, and during that stay when he was greatly troubled by the political preaching he heard in Baptist churches. And this is a side note. I have to say that penned for Rawlyk was literal. George never learned to type, which could be a disadvantage in an academic career, but he turned that defect into a campaign on behalf of the low-wage clerical workers in the Queen's History Department by arguing that the History Department could simply not lay off these people in the secretarial pool so long as a full complement of typists was needed to transform his nearly illegible scrawl into something that was legible. The preface for that last book included a strong critique of preaching that urged a Manichaean battle between faithful Christianity and humanistic liberalism. The preface then went on to explain why George's examination of the extensive interviews from the Angus Reid survey had reassured him. In these interviews, he said, there seemed to be much more stress placed on Christian love and forgiveness than on judgment or culture wars. He was therefore reassured that his study of the contemporary situation would not encourage the transformation of Canadian evangelicalism into some northern version of southern evangelicalism and fundamentalism. Significantly, however, as he shuddered, George simultaneously maintained not only positive, but mutually beneficial relationships with considerable numbers of American evangelicals, and not just his historian friends. If I can extrapolate this aspect of Rawlyk's career into consideration of Canada's future, for this audience, it's probably carrying coals to Newcastle. A fact of Canadian life since the age of television, if not well before, has been the inescapable influence of the United States, most comprehensively for economic life and international relations, but almost as strong for culture defined by music, entertainment, sports, television, and now TikTok and X, formerly known as Twitter. For the future of Canadian evangelicalism, or at least a future with integrity, it will be imperative to monitor carefully the flow of cultural influence streaming north over the border. My own limited experience suggests that Canadian evangelicals have known how to resist the hyper-partisanship, the manic populism, the counter-intellectualism, and partial public ethics that infect parts of American evangelicalism, while also knowing how to benefit from the Americans trying to live out a more excellent way. As they do, they will experience in wider compass what George Rawlyk demonstrated was possible in the limited compass of his own life. Fourth, Rawlyk's contention about the essence of evangelicalism, past and present, suggests an imperatively important lesson for the future of Canadian evangelicalism. As I have mentioned, George on several occasions credited the work of George Marsden and other students of American evangelicalism with aiding his own work. Yet with only a few exceptions, we Americans have not concentrated as George did on what religion means as religion. Our more common pattern has been to study intellectual, social, cultural, political, gendered, institutional, or scientific concomitants of religious experience. Certainly my own emphases following George Marsden have centered on intellectual, political, or cultural questions. Work of that sort certainly yields solid results, and many examples show that it can be done without reducing religious experience to the vanishing point. George, however, came at things with a slight but telling difference. That difference was the foregrounding of the evangelical commitments of the revivals and the revivalists he studied. With increasing concentration over his last decade, he stressed that religious beliefs and practices should be understood first as religion. However much they should continue also to be studied for their political, social, gendered, economic, and intellectual meanings. His final two monographs, The Canada Fire and Is Jesus Your Personal Savior, exemplified the conviction that the essence of evangelicalism, its defining sine qua non, was the experience of faith of ordinary believers. With a deliberately polemical edge, he thus wrote on several occasions, I quote now from one of them, "Religious conversions have actually occurred. People's lives have apparently been profoundly and permanently changed. Conversions still take place, and so do religious revivals." This assertion then has supported his claim that experiential or relational Christianity has always been a defining characteristic of North American evangelicalism, particularly at the popular level of ordinary believers. Now, whether or not Rawlyk got everything right historically, his insistence on the essence of evangelicalism is a word in season for the present as well as for the future. Whatever else the future holds, the way forward for Canadian evangelicals is certainly to keep encounter with God in Christ, encounter with God the Holy Spirit, at the center of their lives, congregations, and outreach to the world. It may, in fact, not be convincing to speculate about Canada's Christian future by reflecting on George Rawlyk and his understanding of Canada's Christian past. Yet at least, as my tribute to a great friend and historian, as well as my effort to encourage this institution to advance boldly into the future, it seemed good to recommend finding hope from the margins, urging savvy exploitation of the remnants of Christendom and selective engagement with the U.S., and praying that whatever comes, evangelicals in Canada will remain evangelical in fact as well as in name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Maybe just want to keep the slide up there so that people see those 4 points. You might want to bounce off of those. So this is your time to ask questions. There's 2 microphones. Bring your questions to the mics. I'll start out, if I may, while these folks formulate their questions. So the bigger theme I'd just like to get you to reflect on, in light of all that you've said about Professor Rawlyk and then your own perspective as well, is the differences between Canadian and American evangelicalism. And you mentioned the word irenic a couple of times, once in your description of what Regent is trying to do or is, and once in George's description of Canadian evangelicalism. So similarities or differences between the 2 forms of evangelicalism on the border, and maybe a little attention to what is irenic about the Canadian approach as opposed to the American.
Well, when you talked with George, you just had to agree that Canadian evangelicals were ironic, because he'd bash you over the head if you disagreed with him. I think what informed his reflection would have been, in this instance, some of what he garnered from Gramsci, notions of intellectual hegemony. That I think he felt that by being a smaller group, and particularly in the post-World War II era, that self-described Canadian evangelicals never had to face the temptation that's sort of in the face of American evangelicals almost all the time, except maybe outside of New England and the far Northwest, but the temptation to worry about lost power and authority and to struggle to get it back. And so once, I think, any group is worried about lost authority and lost power and struggles to get it back, Irenicism begins to leave from the picture. So I don't think he would necessarily approve of that kind of situated as opposed to principled explanation. Henry Allen was not a particularly irenic figure. He was he would preach everywhere, and even especially where he was told not to preach. And I'm not sure that preaching where you're not told not to preach was a model of Irenicism. but the results, I think here, one of the people, I've just mentioned in passing a line that some of you will recognize, that people who've studied the Maritimes don't agree necessarily with George's reading. One of his students, Daniel Goodwin, wrote a terrific book on the Baptists and the generation after Henry Allen. And Dan Goodwin recognized that the Baptists, the several different varieties in the Maritimes, were influenced by the Allenite influence, but also modified it dramatically to become, well, more formal, more interested in education, more concerned about church order, but did so without the kind of aggressive efforts that were seen in the contemporary United States by some of the activities of the American Bible Society, the American Tracts. So whether or not it was its conditions, or whether or not it's size, or whether or not it has to do with working out a principle, I think George was right. And you know, maybe it's just coming up here in the summertime when people seem to be hanging loose and friendly, but I don't remember too many culture war scenes in coming to Regent College chapels. And maybe you do all that in the wintertime when I'm not around.
No, not too much, actually.
Not too much. I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, no, thanks very much,
Sure.
Mark. Bill, question up here at this mic.
As long as you can hear me. Two things of thanks. First of all, thank you for bringing to our recall George Rawlyk. I was undergraduate at Queens. You all think it was in the 90s, but it was actually in the 70s. And he was an amazing figure on campus, and it's wonderful to have him recalled. And also thank you for a lecture that tries to give us something from George that we can think about in our own context and as we look to the future. I don't have a question as much as about the lecture, but coming out of the lecture, it's more for perhaps Mark Noll, and that is that as a dean of historical studies in North America, do you find that in these years, do you find yourself able to draw conclusions from history for the future, or do you find that change is happening so much that you can hardly keep up and record it as a historian because change is happening so quickly, including in the relationship of religion to society? So that's a pretty big question.
You know, it is a big question, and I do think it's a temptation to historians who work on modern history, so 19th century on up, when there are captivating contemporary events, to speak into those events as if the insights gained from historical study provide special or even unique insight. I don't really think that tendency is too helpful, since usually when that happens, the historians' feelings about current events seem to be miraculously what they learned from studying the past. And hopefully, understanding of the present has something to do with having studied the past. By the same token, however, I do think it's important, particularly in the church, for historians of Christian faith to always try to be balancing empathetic participation and working with, and as much critical insight from the past as possible. So I remember being asked in spring of 1976, would I write an article for Christianity Today on believers who rejected the American Revolution? I thought that was really good. I should, because I certainly felt that intellectually, not if I'd been back there at the time, that was different, but intellectually, I was seriously doubting that this was a just war. So I wrote a brilliant article. It was published in Christianity Today, for which there was no response or resonance that I could figure out. So as some of you will remember, if you're American and that old, July 4th, 1976 was a Sunday, and the pulpits of the United States were filled. I believe even Jimmy Carter, the president, or something, or Gerald Ford. At that time, there was just a huge wave of self-congratulatory civil religion that swept over the country and the Christian churches. Well, was it wrong to try to say, well, it's probably good to have an independent nation, but you know, the people who rejected the American Revolution, some of them had some, at least, things worth thinking about. That was a worthy thing to say. In our contemporary situation, we're doing tomorrow in the class that I'm privileged to teach here, how ministers during the American Civil War preached. It's a different matter with chaplains and people in the field, but the ministers at home, all you had to do was ask where they were preaching from, and you could write their sermons. Because with just very few exceptions in the North, and none that I've been able to find in the South, the white northern ministers prayed that the Lord would bless his people to defeat the Confederacy. The white Southern ministers prayed that the Lord would support his people and preserve Confederate independence. And so there are actually today quite a few historians who are writing about that kind of runaway civil religion and the dangers of Christian nationalism, who are at least making the effort to speak a word of moderation and restraint into the American contemporary situation. I believe we're having about the same effect as my article on the Loyalists in 1976.
Good, thank you. Are there other questions out there? Here comes one. Bruce.
Thanks, Mark, and a wonderful opportunity to think about George again. Could you say any more, just invitation to comment more? It just was a small thing in passing, but I was thinking about it when you mentioned the Angus Reid work. But did you say 1/3 of Roman Catholics were pulled out in that survey that didn't know they were evangelicals, that George found that they, the survey picked up evangelical characteristics and just the significance of that? That seems to be really important.
Yes. George relates in the book, Is Jesus Your Personal Savior?, that he was estimated when he was helping Angus Reid put together the survey that it might show 9 or 10% of the Canadian population exhibiting the Bebbington characteristics. And George was, could be persuasive, as you know, and or at least those of you who knew him know. And he in effect wrote about 6 or 7 questions for Angus Reid, and we were told how much each question cost in those days. It was phenomenal. And so there eventually was a little bit of pushback that the questions George formulated were not exactly the Bebbington characteristics, but my goodness, they were about as close as you could come. And so when the results were tabulated, he was actually struck by the fact that 16% of the Canadian population affirmed 3 or 3.5 or 4 of the Bebbington characteristics. Of those 15 or 16%, 1/3 were Roman Catholics. And that actually was not as surprising to me as it was to him, because even at the kind of corner of the world that Wheaton College was, we had seen over my time there, beginning about 1980, an increasingly strong trickle of Roman Catholics who were also active in Young Life, Youth for Christ, or had some kind of contact with a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and who had been advised sometimes by their Catholic superior, well, you're interested in that kind of stuff, why don't you go to Wheaton College? And I had a couple of graduate students, and this would have been maybe about that same time, maybe 80s, early 90s, who came to tell me, well, I've just been hired to teach Bible at the Catholic Church down the road. So it was clear from all sorts of things happening, not just my personal experience, that the Vatican loosening up of the question of lay activity, but then especially with lay activity with the Bible, and in combination with the Catholic charismatic movement that someone like John Marsden has recently documented so very well, there was something happening. And I think what the survey did for George was to find, just to verify that something was happening. I remember, I'm sure it was in Christian Week, that marvelous publication that lasted for, I don't know, 25 or 30 years, coming out of Winnipeg. Around that time, I kept an article about the spread of the Alpha program in this area. You call it the Lower Mainland here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, who was running it? It was a Catholic butcher who had organized Alpha in his parish, and it was so successful that he began to organize in other parishes. He said, well, we have a few Protestants who take part too. but it was mostly Catholic. So I think if George had lived, it would have been interesting to see what he would have done. And Bruce and Darrell Reed were at this conference in 1995, and there was a really interesting, it was actually friendly and respectful, but a real interesting to-do on the floor from someone who said, well, survey, schmurvey, Catholics can't be evangelicals. And George just said, well, look at the thing. I have to pause. Bruce is very kind to raise a question tonight, but I first met Bruce at a conference that George actually helped organize at Wheaton. When? I don't know, 1990 or sometime. And there was multiple sessions going on, and I was at some other session, and George and Nathan Hatch came for eating lunch, and they're both shaking their head and say, there's a young man over there who has a big engine, which was George's way of saying, watch out for this guy. So we did, and he's done all right.
Other questions? I've got another one. If anybody else has also got one, go to the mic. So in terms of your third bullet there, selective engagement with the U.S., particularly, what advice would you give us for individuals, movements, organizations, resources, great ideas from the U.S. side of the border? Because it's hard for us on this side of the border sometimes to keep track of what's so much and what is sometimes confusing from the other side of the border. So what advice in terms of
I think
selective engagement? Give us some cues.
That kind of question does become generically important and practically difficult, given in the social media age where there's no control over what comes in. Not that there was always complete control, but there was some, if you only had 60 medias to attend to, you had a chance, but there's 6,000, you don't have a chance. Well, again, this is a kind of situation where I'm going to tell you what I'm going to express as historical insight, but it's personal prejudice too, well, mostly. I would say if Canadians are able to listen to figures that are trying to be the kind of evangelicals they would like themselves to be. So I'm thinking of the late Timothy Keller, for example, who maintains pretty stiff traditional Christian standards of ethics, but then showed how in New York City, of all places, it was possible to speak responsibly to a major urban population and even challenge that major urban population for repentance, but to do it in a way without driving the population away. World vision. I'll have to say the next thing very carefully. Bread for the World, in its philanthropic efforts, is, I think, a model for Christian philanthropy any place in the world. Period. Here might be a situation or a case where asking academics for advice, not necessarily that you're going to follow it, but say, who are you reading who's not being heralded in social media, but is more or less under the radar, but might be worth listening to. I've gotten to know a little bit Kevin Rowe, who's actually the dean of the faculty of divinity, faculty at Duke University, not of the divinity faculty, but of the faculty, who's a New Testament and early Christian scholar who writes pretty challenging books, but who has really good insights on how the message of the New Testament, and then he carries it through Augustine, is a message for troubled times. And it's analytical and rooted in biblical Christian traditional sources, but Kevin Rowe's not on the CTV that I've been looking at to find out what's happening. Selectivity, trying to not become too engaged. I think maybe for Canadians, at least some Canadian Christians, the real temptation is to be so repulsed by some of what comes across the border as Christian America stuff is just to shut off the United States altogether. And I think that would be a mistake, because there are things to be learned from the right kind of people.
Good, thank you. That's very helpful. Yep, another question up here.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm very, very sympathetic to the hope from the margins theme, but I wonder if it carries with it a danger of a kind of convenient erasure.
Is it, sorry?
Whether it carries with it a risk of a kind of convenient erasure of what's going on at the centre, which might look a lot less ironic. So many examples could be cited, like the cultural power of the Orange Order, for example, at times in Canadian history. And I just wonder how you would reflect on balancing those two.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and this might be one of the attempts to move from a historian's career to an analysis of a current situation needs a lot more work, but I think what lies behind my identifying of this is more historical work on voices in the period I've studied a lot, the first half century of US history, like James W.C. Pennington, who was a black, learned Presbyterian, of which there weren't too many, and was calmly insightful about the race issue in America in the 1840s in a way that almost no one else was. And his work and insights have only been recovered in the last maybe 30 or 40 years. I've mentioned to the class several times a little pamphlet by Daniel Coker, who was one of the founders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who demonstrated a way of using the Bible as fully God's word, but showed how a more synthetic weaving together of biblical narratives and biblical themes could provide a really strong case against the continuation of the American form of race-specific slavery. And that was a tremendous achievement at the time, because the people who were the strongest against slavery tended to drift away from traditional understandings of the Bible. But Coker's understanding was completely orthodox. And the pamphlet wasn't reprinted until after World War II. And so you have people who are thinking deeply and thinking as Christians about a situation then, and it must be the case now. And Regent, I think, has and institutions like Regent have the challenge, but also the opportunity to be alert to voices that they don't normally listen to, and not necessarily take them uncritically. I was glad to quote the little bit from Terry LeBlanc, who I've heard lecture from this podium, because he seems to be an individual who wants to continue. He has a critique of the imperial colonial depredations, but he wants to make that critique as a Christian believer with other Christian believers. And those are the kind of voices that just were not heard for a very long time. maybe throughout into the early 21st century. But they're voices that are challenging because they throw up in the air so many of what had once seemed to be settled. So what does the Bible say? Don't look in your concordance. Let me tell you a story. You know, I'm Presbyterian. I want to look into my concordance.
That's great. Any more questions? All right. There being no more questions, let's show our appreciation for Mark Noll and his time with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us. In just a minute, Mark will position himself up at a book table in the bookstore where you'll be glad to find his books and chat with him more. That's an invitation to you. Also, if you've enjoyed tonight's lecture, I'd invite you to consider making a donation suitable to a movie ticket, perhaps, with a QR code, and you can just take a little picture of that and make a donation to help support summer school and these evening public lectures. I'm delighted that you have been able to be with us, and I wish you a wonderful evening, and come back and see us for another evening public lecture soon. Thanks very much.